Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Beth Coleman, and I'm an associate professor in the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology, and the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. I'm also a research lead at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. So on behalf of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, I'm pleased to introduce you to our first SRI seminar series event of fall 2024. So whether you've participated in past seminars or if it's your first time joining us, I hope you find this series to be a welcome and inspiring place to learn more about important research at the intersection of technology and society. To discuss the societal implications, benefits, and challenges of artificial intelligence systems, data-driven technologies, we have an excellent slate of speakers lined up for this term, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our many incredible guests. Let's start with the land acknowledgement. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this continues to be home to many Indigenous people and a meeting place across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. So a few logistics before we begin. The session is being recorded. Our speaker today will present for about 15 minutes, and we'll have question and answer following the presentation. During the Q&A, we encourage participants to engage by using the raise hand function in the Zoom meeting or type your question in the chat. So without any more ado, I am going to introduce our speaker, Terry Flew. Terry Flew is a professor of digital communication and culture and an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow at the University of Sydney. He leads an ARC discovery project titled Valuing News, Aligning Individual, Institutional, and Societal Perspectives, and oversees the International Digital Policy Observatory at the University of Sydney. Terry has authored nearly 100 works on digital platform governance, digital media industries, artificial intelligence, and internet platform regulation. His most recent book includes Regulating Platforms, and Digital Platform Regulation, Global Perspectives on Internet Governance. He's actively involved in policy work on the socio-ethical implications of digital technologies, advising organizations such as the OECD, Australian Communications and Media Authority, Cisco Systems, Special Broadcasting Service, Meta, and Tiestra. We're excited to have Terry join us today in person from the SRI offices at the University of Toronto, and we're very much looking forward to his presentation, which is titled Trust and Communication, the Question of Mediated Trust. I pass the floor to you, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beth, for that generous and fulsome introduction. I'm very delighted to be here. And like Beth, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to elders and communities past, present, and emerging on which the lands of my own institution, the University of Sydney, are based, and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation have for thousands of years shared and exchanged knowledges across innumerable generations for the benefit of all, and follow Beth in also acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Wendat, the Chippewas, and the Mississauga of Toronto, and extend welcome to any First Nations people in attendance today. I would say I'm also very honoured to be here at the University of Toronto because of the University of Toronto's great influence upon the field of communication. As I was walking past Innes House, I had reason to reflect on the central influence of authors such as Harold Innes and Marshall McLuhan, Eric Havelock, and others, and what is known as the Toronto School of Communication, and the centrality that the Toronto approach has given to the materiality of communications technology. So hopefully my presentation today will be in that spirit. And there has, of course, been a resurgence of interest worldwide in the question of trust. And I've suggested here a number of reasons why this is the case. The rise of populism and perceived political polarisation, a multipolar world, questions of misinformation, disinformation, and indeed information warfare as an element in global contestation, concerns about the extent to which political polarisation has been framed by a sense that there have been those left behind by the economic policies of the last 30 or 40 years. Of course, the speed with which messages travel through global communications networks and social media platforms, and some of you may be familiar with those studies that have found that misinformation tends to travel at 9 times the speed of accurate information. Associated with this, the relative decline of mass media gatekeepers and the crisis of sustainability of traditional news journalism business models, cultural contestation and hyperpartisanship across multiple arenas, and we saw this very markedly in the COVID-19 period. And what we're here today to discuss, the rise of artificial intelligence, creating a new set of questions around trust, including what is human-centred, what is machine-generated, and issues around the authentic and the fake. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has been very focused upon questions of misinformation for a number of years, what he refers to as the infodemic, and this is a quote from the launch of the UN Global Principles for Information Integrity, launched in New York in June of this year, that Guterres has framed the infodemic as a crisis on the scale of global public health disorders and climate change, and that these threats to information integrity, as he sees it, are supercharged by artificial intelligence networks, and when information integrity is targeted, so is democracy. And some of you may have seen recent data that came out this week around the number of the decline in the number of people voting in elections in liberal democracies, combined with a greater degree of scepticism about the outcomes of democratic elections. So there is much that is being managed in the liberal democracies in particular around these questions. Contextualising this discussion, we've had a resurgence of interest in setting policies for digital platforms and addressing the challenges of platform power. Amidst arguments that we're now in an era of the platform economy or platform society, legislators, policymakers, regulators, activists, and indeed other companies have begun to clamour for investigations into the power of digital platforms and their economic, social and political and cultural impacts. The Economist coined the term techlash in 2017 to describe this, and it's been estimated that as of 2023, there are at least 120 public inquiries taking place across different nation states into the power of digital platforms. What we've seen has been a mix of ad hoc responses and more systemic approaches to the power of data-driven digital platforms and their expansion into ever wider domains. And this, I think, contrasts to the historic development of the internet, in particular, the counterposing of regulation to freedom as seen, for instance, in the Freedom House State of the Internet Indexes. It's also seen in the US, I would suggest, in the Biden-Harris administration being considerably more interventionist towards digital platforms than its predecessors. As we turn to artificial intelligence, we're talking about a term that has a long history. This has to be kept in mind that Alan Turing's pioneering essay was published in Mind in 1950. The first symposium to discuss artificial intelligence was held at Dartmouth College in 1956. Many of these figures, such as Claude Shannon, Marvin Minsky, and Herbert Simon, would be central to how AI would evolve over the next 2 to 3 decades. Of course, in popular culture, what we now refer to as AI has long been anticipated, particularly in Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey, where, as you would recall, the computer HAL comes to be aware of what the astronauts have in mind to abort the mission and seeks to stop them from doing so. And one of the first major critiques of artificial intelligence, Hubert Dreyfus's book, What Computers Can't Do, The Limits of Artificial Intelligence, was first published in 1972. And I would suggest Dreyfus's critique of artificial intelligence, which is the difficulty of replicating the human brain through machines, to put it at its simplest, came from his proximity to centres of AI such as the RAND Corporation, MIT, UC Berkeley and Stanford. I think there's an interesting story to be told there about the relationship of the humanities to the development of artificial intelligence. So Dreyfus's book has gone through multiple editions and has always been something AI researchers have felt the need to critically engage with. We find globally that national AI strategies, we have 75 national AI strategies have been announced as of 2023. This compares to 1 in 2016. So there had a degree of attention given to AI has been something of a surge in recent years, and this is taken from the Stanford Human-Centered AI Index for 2024. And AI-related legislation by country, we can see the number of bills that have been passed over the period from 2016 to 2023. My own country, Australia, being somewhat slower than Canada and other countries in developing in this space, but a real takeoff in AI-related inquiries and legislation in Australia over the last 2 years. So there are many issues of concern we could discuss here. I think one useful way of capturing these comes from the UK House of Commons inquiry into artificial intelligence in 2023 that identifies 12 issues of concern here that include bias, privacy, misrepresentation, access to data and computing power, the lack of transparency, open source models, intellectual property questions, liability, employment, international coordination, and indeed the existential challenges of AI. We could add to this list one that is missing there are the ecological challenges associated with running powerful data centres. But this provides us, I think, with a good overview of the range of issues with which we are dealing, which could be encapsulated around these 5 dimensions of AI regulation. I present a slightly sinister pentagram here, no satanic principles involved here, but I think you could capture these around questions related to power and political economy, representation, law and governance, accountability and transparency. I'll have more to say about that in the presentation. So moving now to the question of trust and communication. Why does trust matter? Trust matters for a variety of reasons. Antonio Guterres, who I referred to earlier, has identified a malady of mistrust and a surge of mistrust leading to a breakdown in values. Trust impacts upon the functioning of institutions, the willingness to make risky decisions, and indeed upon economic innovation, questions of citizen engagement with public institutions, the capacity to economise on regulation because of the question of whether citizens will comply with laws and regulations in the absence of sanctions, questions of social cohesion and legitimacy of political institutions. And as I note there, the Australian Productivity Commission identified trust as a central driver for widespread acceptance of AI. Trust is one of those terms with a variety of definitions, and it's also often noted that, as Bernd Blaubaum put it, trust is not visible and difficult to describe. Trust exists, so it is something tangible, but at the same time, trust remains abstract. John Elster identified trust as a specific causal pattern that can be recognised after the event, but rarely foreseen. Jeffrey Hodgkin, in his History of Trust, defines trust as attachment to a person, collective of persons or institutions, based on the well-founded but not certain expectation that he, she or they will act for my good, and expectation based upon good but less than perfect evidence that events will turn out in ways not harmful to me. So trust relies upon a degree of uncertainty and a degree of risk. Confidence is sometimes used as a synonym for trust. And indeed, there are some questions about whether the term trust is used where other terms such as confidence or calculativeness may capture the concept better. But trust exists in a median state between pure randomness and absolute certainty. In my own work, I found it very useful to understand trust as working at three levels. And indeed, in the communications discipline, I have been involved in developing a taxonomy of articles according to the extent to which they address these three levels of trust. So we have trust at the individual or intergroup, interpersonal trust or intergroup trust, existing at the level of individuals and typically around face-to-face interactions, although that clearly changes in the era of social media. Then we have a second level of organisational or institutional trust. And finally, we have questions of societal trust. And sociologists have grappled with these distinctions for a number of, for pretty much the history of the discipline. So Emile Durkheim raised the question of why is it that individuals choose to legitimise a society as something by which they are bound, identifying the division of labour as critical to that. George Simmel identified the duality of individual identities, that we are both people and bearers of social identities, and that those social identities or socialisation processes are an important dimension of trust. So my status as an academic exists alongside of, yet independently of, my persona, and it gives me certain ethical and moral obligations. Max Weber, I think we owe a great deal to in this space, in that Weber was less concerned with trust at a societal level than trust in social institutions. So societal trust was something that moved upwards from trust in particular institutions. The sociological perspectives on trust typically take societal trust as the starting point, although Jack Barbalet has critiqued the vocabulary of trust, arguing that in some instances what we're referring to is what he calls precarious institutional maturity. Yes, a number of you would be aware the sociological perspectives on routine, reflexivity, risk society have also strongly foregrounded trust. One approach which I've become quite interested in personally has been that taken by the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, whose starting point is social trust. He makes the point that familiarity is the condition for trust. We need history. We need history, and we need collective history in order to have trust in the present, that the conferring of trust is based upon prior experience. But it's not simply an inference from the past, but it provides a basis for managing risk going forward into the future. So, as he puts it, the complexity of the future world is reduced by the act of trust. And as the social order becomes more complex and variable, as we lose the matter-of-fact character, the reliance on face-to-face interactions taken for granted, familiarity, trust becomes increasingly central, yet the very complexity of the social order creates a greater need for coordination and for determination of the future, i.e. a need for trust. Yet that trust can never be absolute. The condition of trust is the possibility that trust would be betrayed. So in the literature on trust, we find a question about to what extent is trust contingent upon trustworthiness? So is trust something that can only be extended to trustworthy individuals, trustworthy organisations, and how do they come to establish themselves as trustworthy? So Catherine Hawley identifies trustworthiness as being demonstrated by both a commitment and a capacity to act, and being able to be, and that others can rely upon the trustworthy over time. Luhmann takes a slightly different perspective in understanding trust in organised systems as being akin to trust in money and trust in the state, resting upon expectations supported by evidence over time. I should say there are a lot of parallels to be drawn between the communication space and the financial space, which are often not drawn, but the classical sociological literature has long posed this question of why do we trust money? And I think why we trust money and why we trust information are interconnected questions. So Lerman did not place as much of an emphasis upon the trustworthiness of individuals, i.e. do we need to know anything about the characteristics of the bus driver or the train driver in order to trust that the bus or train will come on time. Rather, we rely on the idea that everyone involved is motivated by complex, prone to failure and not readily visible detours to produce fall fruit jam, insurance notices, drive the bus to the stop, enable society to function. So this question of whether social trust rests upon individual trust continues to emerge in the literature. So as I pointed out in classical sociology, this question of why individuals consent to form a society is central. So I'm quite interested in Weber's notion that trust is an intermediate relationship to individual institutions, and with that, to an institutional order that forms interdependencies between individuals, institutions, and society. Economics takes a slightly different perspective on this. Russell Harden has referred to trust as encapsulated interest, or at its simplest, A trusts B to do or in regard to X. So this does not rely upon the moral or ethical characteristics of the trustor or the trustee, but rather upon the mutual benefit that they derive from an ongoing relationship that enables the reduction of transaction costs. And this is what he refers to as encapsulated interest rather than moral disposition that's critical to trust over time. I should say Harden's perspective is widely critiqued by other economists. For the Nobel Prize-winning economist Oliver Williamson, this is actually calculativeness, that trust needs to be understood as something that sits outside of the economics of rational choice. Kenneth Arrow, another Nobel Prize-winning economist, reached a similar point in his 1974 book, The Limits of Organisation, where he referred to trust as an invisible institution. And Martin Hollis makes the point that the pursuit of self-interest in the absence of values of altruism, solidarity, mutuality, etc., can make it rational to betray the trust of others. So a theory of trust also requires a theory of distrust. So communications as a discipline, I would argue, has often discussed trust, and I have identified this in a couple of papers, but the term has often been implicit rather than explicit. And for example, if we take the work of Jürgen Habermas, the focus has been on truth rather than trust as the foundation for communicative action, although even Habermas, the supreme rationalist, acknowledges in his three worlds of communicative action that they are the objective, the social, and the subjective, that the truth of statements arises not only from their epistemic rationality, but also out of their ethical and moral rationality, the shared commitment to a just social contract, and an empathetic understanding of the other. I would suggest that these are relations of trust as distinct from truth. The legacy of critical theory weighs strongly here in that there has been much focus on the conditions, economic, cultural, ideological, political, etc., and I'll be thinking here about post-Frankfurt School critical theory, that systematically distort communication through the circulation of mistruths. And it has been suggested by Steve Fuller and others that mediatisation is the condition of what we now call post-truth ideologies, because the process through which various societal spheres and institutions are subsumed under media logics is the condition for what we might refer to as post-truth statements. So a positive role for communication in understanding trust would focus upon two things in particular. Firstly, it's the question of the representational turn. If the representational turn implies that societies need to be understood as being founded in discourse, defined by Foucault as a historically contingent social system that produces knowledge and meaning, and understanding discourses to be material in their effects, then communication becomes the basis through which these interactions occur. And when I say communication, I'm understanding it as multimodal. I'm not focusing solely upon the written word or oral communication, or indeed electronic communication, but upon the totality of symbolic forms of symbolic representation through which we communicate and interact with one another. And there's a variety of authors who've identified society as being founded in and through communication, including John Dewey, Raymond Williams, James Carey, and Christian Fuchs. The second set of insights I believe communication offers to an understanding of trust are to recognise that the three levels of communication I've been discussing there, the macro, the meso, and the micro, are not only interconnected but also technologically mediated. If we use the broad definition of media as any channel or platform or medium that enables communication, we can see how all levels of societal interaction have always had an element of technologically mediated communication associated with them. Think, for instance, about how universities moved from paper-based communication, memos in pigeonholes and students putting pieces of paper into boxes, to electronically mediated communication. Think, for instance, about the way in which this symposium is being presented today. And from a methodological perspective, the challenge of the internet has been that it collapsed the distinction made famous by the communication scholar Everett Rogers, that there were two types of communication, communication between people and communication that involved devices, as those two modes of communication now coexist in ever more complex forms of interplay, marking what the Amsterdam scholar Richard Rogers, no relation to Everett, referred to as the end of the digital. Which brings me to the concept of mediated trust. The concept of mediated trust captures both the centrality of communications to trust and the evolving technological infrastructures through which mediated communications occurs. Balázs Bodo has observed that digital technologies shape how humans trust one another, and in order to fulfill this task, they need to be trustworthy. Focusing on the historical development of institutional trust, Bodo argues that the concept of mediated trust incorporates both the dimensions through which digital technologies promote trust through technology, question of trusted systems, and the discursive frameworks associated with trust in technology. How do we think about trust in technology? And I should say those discursive frameworks can also promote distrust in technology. Think about both the utopian and dystopian paradigms we've seen towards robots in Hollywood cinema, for instance. Mike Schaefer, referring to science communication, has made the point that trust in science is to a considerable extent the outcome of mediated communication, since, as he observes, public trust in science is to a considerable degree influenced by media representations of science, its protagonists and institutions. Trust intermediaries double the configuration of trust. They are themselves potential objects which the public may or may not trust. And for those of you who've been engaged with science communication, you would know of the ongoing debate around the representation of science in the media, particularly with regards to human-induced climate change. So in thinking about AI policy, what are some of the lessons we can take from AI governance? And a framework I've employed to understand this is what I refer to as the 3 I's, which actually have their roots in the work of Max Weber. And the 3 I's are ideas, interests, and institutions. And in my 2021 book, Regulating Platforms, I used these to undertake a synoptic history of the early internet and how decisions made in the early years of the internet have continued to shape industry structures, public policies, and cultural debates today. So ideas are ways of thinking about material objects and relationship that rise to prominence and general social acceptance. So I noted there the manner in which Foucault used the concept of discourses. I should also note the concept of mental models that Denzow and North have put forward, and the cognitive shortcuts associated with what Daniel Kahneman famously referred to as thinking fast and thinking slow. Dominant ideas are, of course, always contested, although the grounds on which they are contested shift over time. So We may see, for instance, an underlying thread of libertarianism in thinking about the internet, but I would suggest that the libertarianism of 2024 is profoundly different to the libertarianism of 1994, or put differently, Elon Musk is not the descendant of Howard Rheingold. The second I is that of interest, which refers to institutions and organisations that seek to advance their individual or collective power in the economic, political and cultural spheres. Broadly speaking, this is the political economy of digital capitalism, although it also points to the role of countervailing interests, including NGOs, activist groups and political leaders. And the third I is that of institutions, as organisational forms that both govern and regulate economic, social and political relations, and through which collective decision-making occurs. We are familiar with formal institutions as constellations of interest which enable collective action responses in an uncertain external environment. But we should note that as well as formal institutions, there are informal institutions, or what the economist Douglas North refers to as the rules of the game in a society, or the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction. And I'd suggest that ideas and institutions link through that concept of informal institutions, just as interests and institutions link through formal institutions. So ideas provide the mental maps or shared mental models through which individual cognition and social practice can align, through the mediation of formal institutions that can represent and balance competing interests. So in the early history of the internet, the argument I make in regulating platforms is that dominant ideas shaped institutions before the major corporate interests had emerged. So the IPO for Google is in 1999. By this time, the Communications Act has already been passed in the United States, and ICANN has been established in 1998. So the dominant domestic and international forces of governance, at least in the liberal democracies, are in place before most of the big companies we associate today with the digital economy in existence. Facebook's IPO was in 2004. Some of those dominant ideas, what Wired magazine famously referred to as the fusion of free minds and free markets, include this primacy of individual freedom, the identification of government as the main threat to individual freedom. That's something that's changed over time, as I'll indicate. The market economy has been at the core of innovation and the risks to innovation presented by excessive government regulation. The idea that the internet is fundamentally different to other media, this developed particularly strongly in the United States, to the point where the Federal Communications Commission effectively ruled itself out of internet governance, I think much to the regret of policymakers 25, 30 years later. And a degree of communitarianism around the inherent value of open information, and a certain degree of romanticism around technology for a better world. And authors such as Fred Turner and Thomas Streeter, among others, have dealt with these questions. So Section 230 of the US Communications Act comes out, which gives the core protections to digital platforms, comes out the idea that the internet is fundamentally different to media, and the multi-stakeholder model of global internet governance comes out of the idea that corporations and civil society, rather than governments, should be the primary drivers of global internet governance. So we have, as I described at the outset, this regulatory turn, which comes from a variety of factors: competition leading to monopoly in the digital economy, the many downsides of free speech and the extent to which speech in the online domain can be seen to directly connect to harms, vilification, riots, etc. in the social framework, a growing sense of impatience with industry self-regulation, the concerns about the power of platform or surveillance capitalism documented by Shoshana Zuboff, Nick Srinicek and others, the populist turn in liberal democracies, and by populist I don't simply mean Trumpian or other comparable populisms of the nationalist right, but I mean a sense to which if you like, the consensus model of the early 2000s, which Thomas Friedman famously defined as a framework that grows your economy and shrinks your politics, has been increasingly contested. And finally, I think an important factor to consider is the role of intercapitalist competition and political lobbying. So if we think, for instance, about the rise of news media bargaining codes in Australia, Canada, and elsewhere, they remind us that incumbent media retains considerable clout in its dealing with digital platforms. So this context, how it frames the emerging AI policy landscape, I think in contrast to the early internet, AI development has been largely led by established corporate giants. We know who are the companies who hold the bulk of data, and we expect those companies to be the dominant players in the AI space, what in the share trading world are referred to as the Magnificent Seven. These companies are widely known. And this is because the data-driven economy has very strong economies of scale and scope. We've discovered that the digital economy generally has very strong economies of scale and scope, contrary to the ideas that the early internet would bring about an era of Schumpeterian creative destruction and promote greater competition. We find that digital markets are actually more concentrated than those of traditional media, and this is accentuated in the AI space. We also find that the state is a central player in the AI environment, that the prioritisation given to AI development is being actually shaped very strongly by the state in directing economic rents towards AI sectors, in part because of technological nationalism and what Milton Muller and Farhat refer to as digital neo-mercantilism, and Farrell and Newman refer to as weaponised interdependence. Its most obvious markers being the extent to which technology is strongly implicated in contestation between the United States and China. But we also see the European Union seeking to exercise the Brussels effect of a regulatory lever to try and shape these global tech giants. But we find in a variety of countries forms of tech nationalism informing AI development. The United Kingdom, I think, is an interesting one in its aims to be what was referred to by the previous government as an AI superpower, whatever that might mean. AI is assumed to be risky and to therefore require regulatory guardrails and frameworks to be in place. While there is definitely a counter position, and I think about venture capitalists such as Mark Andreessen and their techno-optimist manifesto, and groups coming out of Silicon Valley such as the self-described effective accelerationists. These are, I think, a minority position in the AI policy discourse. I'm not ruling out the possibility that that might change. I think it's very notable, the political shift within Silicon Valley over the last decade. It is possible, were it the Trump administration to be elected in the US, that we may see a rise of an accelerationist discourse. But at this stage, I think there's a stronger sense that human-centred AI, focus on risk, regulatory frameworks are prevailing. And the question I've posed is whether national AI strategies are effectively being aligned with what Anu Bradford described as the three digital empires, the US, China, and the European Union, or whether they are developing their own dynamics. And I think second-tier countries such as Canada, Australia, South Korea, the UK, and others provide very interesting test beds for that question. So coming back to trust and communication, as I noted, a lot of associated concepts to trust have come through in communications discourse, and these are some of the ones I would share: communicative action, media influence, agenda setting, framing, effective news, mediated populism, misinformation, and moral panics. But as I noted, there has been a stronger focus upon truth than upon trust. And I think this is seen in Jürgen Habermas's humanist work, and I'm drawing here on Outhwaite's summary of Habermas's many works in the Encyclopedia of Applied Ethics, and three core concepts that come from that. The concept of action, communicative action, as action oriented by or in pursuit of mutual understanding, which is contrasted to strategic action. The idea of an ideal speech situation, which makes a justified consensus possible and is an implicit aim of sincere communication, and validity claims that all assertoric utterances presuppose the intelligibility, truth, legitimacy, and sincerity of their assertion. Now, to be clear, all of those attributes are attributes of a human speaker. And they point to questions around the ethics of human agents, the practices of institutions governed by humans, such as the media, and shared human understanding. So this is very much a notion of society as an aggregation upwards of individuals and institutions, and hence a humanist conception of trust. So trust here rests upon trustworthiness. A somewhat different non-humanist conception of trust comes from Reisman, who I've referred to earlier. Reisman is a systems theorist, and he proposes that there are three types of systems. There are living systems, which his work by and large doesn't deal with, psychic systems or consciousness, and social systems grounded in communication. And those social systems are an aggregation of interactions, organisations, and societies. Now, what's important here from Reisman is that psychic systems and social systems are seen as structurally distinct. Okay, so whereas for Habermas, the social system is effectively an aggregation of psychic systems in that it is an aggregation of a variety of forms of human consciousness and understanding. Here, the social system is a structural form that largely exists independently of the individuals that constitute it. So this is where this concept of systems trust comes from Reisman. So trust here is a medium of symbolically generalised communication whose social acceptance enables the management of uncertainty in complex systems. And it is the absence of human co-presence that makes this critical. So trust does not here rest upon the trustworthiness of individuals. Trust is rather one of five symbolically generalised media of communication alongside power, law, money, and love. And these media of communication circulate reflexively to promote what's referred to as trust in trust. So society here becomes the sum of all communication. In this environment, institutions flourish as they have the temporal horizons which go beyond the lifespans of their individual members. So the University of Toronto, the University of Sydney, the Government of Toronto, the Government of Canada, etc., are both constituted through the individuals that have leadership roles in them, but have an institutional form that exists independently of those institutions. So we're reminded here, I think, in the digital space, of the extent to which are the largest digital platform companies tied to their founders? I think that's an interesting question to consider. Or will they become organisational forms that go on independently of their founders? So the flourishing of institutions as containers of trust arises from that existing independently of the individuals who founded them. And so as trust has devolved to AI, the relationship of trust to trustworthiness is complex. What does it mean to trust or distrust an algorithm? And I think it's striking the extent to which we seek to anthropomorphise that question around a trust in Mark Zuckerberg or a trust in Elon Musk. Trust or distrust in algorithms is a difficult concept to wrestle with. If we take the classic model of communications that send a message, receive a model, the process model proposed by Shannon and Weaver in the 1940s, we can see what it means to bring a non-human dimension into this. So the communications agent may be a person, but they may be non-human, they may be a bot. What does it mean? What does it mean to get customer service online from a bot as distinct from getting customer service online from a person, for example? The message may be created within software. Think about the extent to which ChatGPT is now routinely used to generate letters, emails, newsletters, a variety of not particularly complex forms of writing, but forms of writing that are nonetheless taken to be as if they were created by a human. And of course, the communications receiver may be non-human. Think, for instance, about the ways in which programs such as Microsoft Outlook sort your email into those matters that are important and those matters which are less important. So the extent to which we're pleased that we don't have to find out about 20% off something that we signed on to as a condition for getting to our work emails. But you can see here across sender, message and receiver, we're talking about communications that involve and arguably increasingly involve non-human as well as human agents. Trust is a significant and shifting concept in AI, and to take a couple of quotes here from different public inquiries. Michael Birtwistle from the Ada Lovelace Institute observed that we need public trust, we need these technologies to be trustworthy, and that is worth investing regulatory capability in. Now, note the extent to which many of those involved in the development of AI are actually calling for the regulation of AI. That may be something we want to discuss in the Q&A. So the UK Department of Science, Innovation and Technology observes trust is a critical driver for AI adoption. If people do not trust AI, they will be reluctant to use it. Such reluctance can reduce demand for AI products and hinder innovation. But of course, what will it mean to trust AI? Are we talking about trusted systems? Are we talking about AI ethics? Are we talking about self-regulatory codes? Are we talking about legislation to secure accountability and transparency? The most ambitious attempt to develop that so far being the European Union's AI Act. Is trust in AI focused upon trust in technological systems and processes, trust in the people involved in their development, application and use, or trust in those entities primarily associated with their development? And how does trust or distrust of other institutions impact upon public trust in AI? So are our assumptions about trusting AI products developed by Microsoft, Alphabet or Meta grounded in prior levels of trust that we have in those companies themselves? So we can see that we have three modes of communication, and there's, I've been drawing here on the work of David Gunkel from Northern Illinois University, noting something of a minority history in communications discourse. If we take the dominant model to be that of mediated communication and since the 1990s, computer-mediated communication, this is human-to-human communication mediated by technologies. We're very much in the world here of the Habermasian problematic of the ideal speech situation and communicative action. Yet we have, and have had for many years, human-machine communication, such forms including automated decision-making, algorithmic sorting, machine learning, and most recently generative AI. And we're moving towards environments of machine-to-machine communication. So all those wonderful scenarios of our fridge talking to our supermarket about whether we need a carton of milk, and our supermarket then talking to our credit card about purchasing that carton of milk, and presumably the supermarket then talking to a drone that delivers that carton of milk. So we can foresee here a scenario where the seamless delivery of a carton of milk can happen without any direct human engagement with it. So inserting AI governance into these communicative settings requires us to consider questions including bias, privacy, misrepresentation, power imbalances, sources and uses of data, international cooperation versus competition, accountability and transparency. So if I was to conclude by suggesting some priorities for responsible and trusted AI, and there are a lot of reports being generated that generate different kinds of lists. Some of those would include considering the human impacts of automation, particularly the impacts in the sphere of work. And there are arguments that I find reasonably persuasive to suggest that there may be a propensity to overestimate the extent to which artificial intelligence will replace people. I think the Hollywood writers' strike was a very interesting case study in the creative industries around the implications of generative AI for fields such as script writing. And what I would note is that important in that debate is the question of the threshold of creativity. Creativity, Margaret Bowden has, I think, convincingly argued, has an integral relationship to technology. So there is a technological frontier that enables different forms of creativity over time. Yet the difficulty in defining creativity makes it difficult to determine the extent to which machines have creativity, because we tend to default to an assumption of creativity as synonymous with the human brain, in which case the argument becomes tautological. Or put differently, a computer can clearly write a film script. Whether it's a good script, that's the question. So we need active labour market policies that enable upskilling to occur at the very least. There's a need to address market power in the distribution of data capabilities. It is very possible that AI will supercharge the sort of monopolistic tendencies associated with data-driven economies, and anti-monopoly strategies that address platform conglomerates are increasingly important. So the United States Department of Justice case against Google is a very interesting case study in this. Embedding user consent protocols into data access is something that is clearly of increasing importance. The question of creator rights and intellectual property is a complex one, but there are clearly people and communities, culturally marginalised communities, First Nations people, etc., for which this hoovering up of data is another form of colonialism. And Nick Caldry and Ulysses Meisner have referred to this as data colonialism. And so creator rights are going to be something that we need a new bargain on. The promotion of workforce diversity in AI-related employment will be part of the challenge in addressing systemic biases. It won't in and of itself address systemic biases, but it's clearly important. Disinformation laws and related measures to impose sanctions for the willful misuse of AI tools to cause harm or to mislead. Debate that is very lively in Australia, and is very lively globally, actually, but I know in Australia legislation is being actively considered around this, is the use of deepfakes in political advertising, and the clarification of lines of accountability and liability for systemic failings in acquisition of data and uses of AI, that the providers of AI tools and services should not be able to simply default to blaming the machine. And this will, I believe, require external regulatory regimes. Other issues to consider in developing such frameworks are, will we follow the risk-based matrix that has been pioneered by the EU with the AI Act, where, say, the risk associated with a spell checker is clearly minimal compared with that of a driverless car? I have some thoughts about that we may want to bring forward in the Q&A, that some risks are definitely underestimated. Are we talking about all-in-one omnibus acts, or are we talking about an iterative process of lawmaking here? What will be the balance between public and private regulation, and what will be the balance between national and international regulation? Recognising that we're both in an era of technopolitics where I think there are stronger expectations around the regulation of AI, but a geopolitics that promotes competition between the leading AI players globally. And at that point, I will finish my formal presentation and open up to Q&A. Thank you very much.
If you have a question, raise your hand in the chat function, or put it in the chat function in the Zoom, and you'll get a prompt to unmute. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to start and just kicking off the question round. So Terry, fascinating and rich. I had a question that is kind of asking around two phases of the Lumen material that you were discussing. In thinking about a need for collective history for trust, how do we address the newness and the difficulty of knowing what the kind of diversity of AI is as a public? And the other side of that I would want to ask is, if trust is not reliant on the trustworthiness of individuals, what about the trustworthiness of technologies? How do we frame a trustworthiness of AI as a technology? And if I may, can you talk about that in terms of the effectiveness of regulation, a projection around how you think regulation can do there?
Thank you very much, Beth. I think to take the second question first, the trustworthiness of technologies question, there's not going to be a single answer to that, because at some level it will come back to the trustworthiness of the organisational entities associated with developing the technologies, which brings the human back in, I would suggest. So if we think about, privacy, for instance, some companies such as Apple have placed a greater priority upon security of data than, for instance, companies such as Meta. So there may well be differences there in the ways in which organisations choose to approach these questions. There are closely geographical differences. So there is greater scope in the European Union to closely research digital companies than there is, say, for instance, in Australia. So I know of researchers who go to the European Union countries annually in order to do precisely that research without the fear of being litigated against. So the institutional framework is going to continue to matter, and we will find, and I think we'll see in the regulatory space, we have a familiar challenge here about the extent to which countries will choose to be leaders in AI regulation as compared to those who will choose to minimise AI regulation, possibly in the hope of being hosts to major AI companies. This is a not unfamiliar question. We think about the history of finance, for instance. There have always been countries that have promoted the absence of regulation of their financial institutions as a way of attracting banking services. We know that in the context of those sort of competing national agendas, we look to supranational solutions for that. Though I think the environment for a supranational grand bargain at the moment is not a fortuitous one. It's considerably less fortuitous than in sort of the heyday of liberal institutionalism of the early 2000s. I've forgotten the first question there. My apologies.
Public trust and the idea of a collective history is needed for public trust, but with both the publicly newness of AI and also the difficulty of grasping what it is, what are your thoughts about that?
I think what will be important there will be early impressions. So if I was to take the issue of deepfakes, for example, deepfakes, as we know from the history of cinema, deepfakes have a long history. King Kong did not get to the top of the Empire State Building and so on. We also know that the extent to which fakes are believed is not contingent upon the technology itself. So when audiences were terrified by that rather rubber-looking shark in Jaws in 1975, this was not a product of the technology, but of the way in which director Spielberg had set up expectations in the film, and that's the wonder of cinema. We will continue to get ever better cinematic replications of the real. Whether they're persuasive will depend upon things other than the technology itself. But I think that we need clear boundaries to this. And so I don't think you can legislate to completely prohibit deepfakes. But I think you can set clear boundaries around the use of deepfakes in matters of public importance and areas where legislation already exists. So I focus there on political advertising, because political advertising marks a point where there is existing legislation that can be extended to cover the use of AI, and where there's clearly public importance to acting on this, and acting on this fairly quickly. And I've also noted in the Australian context, acting on it outside of the electoral cycle, because once you're in an election campaign, the temptation to use it against the other lot becomes all too tempting. So I think that we never start with a completely blank slate. This is the notion that Justice Easterbrook the Chicago lawyer referred to in the 1990s as the law of the horse, that we don't simply bring in a set of laws to cover a technology, that what emerges is a patchwork of laws that have, in some instances, histories going back centuries. But I think that public confidence in the net benefits of AI are partly based around early action. That said, if I could just make one other point, there is considerable skepticism about AI that may not be warranted by outcomes. So I'll give an example. In Australia, in the state of Queensland, and I know this from my colleagues who ran the Centre for Robotics, the state of Queensland is now the largest manufacturer of motor vehicles, which it's not associated with being, because it's not seen as a manufacturing state. But that has been driven by the very extensive use of robots in these factory settings, although when the word factory is still right to describe them would be another point, but let's call them factories for now. Yet, and that's created a lot of jobs, but governments are reluctant to talk about it because robots are associated with the elimination of jobs. So I think, we bring some public perceptions to these matters that already frame some of the ways in which we think about the possibilities and the threats of AI.
Thank you. I've got a question in the chat that everyone can see, and then I've got a hand up. So I'm going to start with Keith Parady's question. What is your perspective on how best to evaluate the pros and cons of techno-optimism versus a more risk-focused approach to AI? How significant do you think the risk is?
Well, first of all, with regards to the techno-optimists, what really strikes me is how beleaguered they look. Compared to the 1990s, these guys are old. This is not the frontier. The frontier of thought in the 2020s is not Mark Andreessen and his friends in Silicon Valley. This is not to say that they don't have political clout, but it is to say that compared to the sort of enthusiasm around the internet in the 1990s, this discourse looks really tired. It looks like it's driven by other things, like their antipathy to DEI agendas and social justice. It looks unconvincing. And I think at this juncture, most of the corporate sector is keeping its distance from the techno-optimist manifesto. Not to say it, although it clearly has some very very vocal and influential champions such as Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. The risk-based approach, I think, is an understandable response. I think that there are uses of AI that are relatively unproblematic and uses of AI that present a lot of challenges. Driverless cars or robots doing operations are examples that are often cited. But I do think there are some difficulties in the mid-range, if I was to say. So I think, for instance, about the extent to which the use of algorithms for credit scores impacts upon the likelihood of people getting finance, the ways in which apparently benign AI systems may sort people for their suitability for different types of jobs in ways that have embedded biases within them. I think that between those sort of, extremes of the driverless car that careens off the road and, kills passengers, and, your phone correcting your spelling, I think there are risks in that intermediate space that arguably the risk-based framework underestimates. So I think at some point we will need to revisit the risk-based framework around some of those sorts of issues.
Okay, good. Alicia, did you want to ask your question? You're welcome to turn on your camera. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, Terry. Thanks so much for joining us today. I work at SRI as a policy researcher, and I work with Beth on some of our trust-related work. So I really wanted to ask about a concept you mentioned in passing a couple times, which is that of distrust, and really the degree to which you think this is an equally important concept comparative to trust. Just to kind of set up the question a bit, I realize it is quite a delicate balance because on the one hand, the distrust that kind of spawns from poor experiences with AI systems corresponds to the erosion of trust in people and systems and the institutions alike. But at the same time, you kind of heard the argument that it does play a crucial role in checking balances and powers with ML systems, and keeps the user kind of aware and making those judgments themselves. So specifically, you mentioned the infodemic. I think that's really important, specifically around deep fakes, but kind of on the other end of things with the liar's dividend and how real information can then kind of be polluted and be claimed as fake as a result. So I guess to summarize that all into a question, I would say that in addition to mechanisms to build trust, in your eyes, is it also equally important to foster distrust in advanced technologies, specifically as it relates to the information ecosystem? And kind of latching on to that, what tools can be created or leveraged to enhance trust or distrust in the information ecosystem, both around deepfakes and that liar's dividend?
Great question, thank you. Immanuel Kant in 18th century Germany called upon us to question but obey. With regards to the question of if you were a critic of the state, how could you therefore justify paying taxes to that state of which you were a critic? And he distinguished between the public and private use of reason in that regard, and that question of whether we too much trust in our institutions would not be a good thing, and indeed it's it's the struggle going back to the revolutions that founded modernity, that we bring a degree of skepticism towards institutional authority. One way to think about it is this distinction that's made between mistrust and distrust. And if I think, I'll take the field of media studies, which I come from. So mistrusting the media has quite a long history. Okay, so it's routinely found that journalists are not a highly trusted professional occupation. But this may take the form, I mistrust that media, I don't know, Fox News or something, but I trust public broadcasting or something like that. I may trust some media and not others. But what has long sat under that is a kind of second order understanding whereby the facts which the different media report upon are the facts. The interpretations of those facts vary. And here we've slipped into a somewhat different realm, a realm of alternative facts and conspiracy theories and whatnot that I'm we're all very familiar with. And here we get to kind of distrust that congeals into distrust of a full gamut of institutions. And from the data I've seen in Australia, probably somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% of the population have become full-scale distrusters, and will distrust AI. And as I noted, there will be a tendency to want to anthropomorphise the distrust of AI. This may be a distrust of other people's AI and a trust in AI that reinforces their own viewpoints. That's a real possibility. The challenge in the regulatory space is it's the familiar challenge of developing sustainable models of regulation in the face of political partisanship. And we have historically in liberal democracies relied upon the status of independent experts, including the academic community, to provide guidance in that respect. And that will be where things will need to be going forward. But we are aware that it's a period of distrust of experts, as the former UK Minister Michael Gove put it. People have become sick of experts. It's an era of populist solutions. I think we're probably going to need to be, having been an advisor to government agencies myself, very good advice I got from a minister I was working from was, well, you call it as you see it, we'll manage the politics of it. I think something like that is where we need to be. And it's very, if you've read Wendy Brown's recent Tanner lectures, it's very striking the extent to which in addressing the threat of political nihilism and cultural nihilism, as she refers to it, she returns to something like an ethos of public service as articulated by sociologists such as Max Weber. I think that's a very interesting turn that a critical theorist would return to that notion of an ethos of public service. And I think there's probably something in that around the question of, if you like, defending a second-order institutional framework in the context of valid disagreement and contestation around pathways forward.
We have a question from Lisa Austin, the Associate Director of SRI.
There we go. Hi, Terry. Thanks for such an interesting talk. So I'm a law professor. I'm going to come at this from sort of a regulatory perspective. So I find it super fascinating and have for some time now that this language of trust has kind of taken over, and we're thinking about, how do we ensure trustworthy AI? But I'm also struck by when I was looking at the items on your slide about how do we ensure trustworthy AI, and I would say as a lawyer, I could justify all those things without the language of trust. So, we might use a framework of justice, which would include rights and freedoms, but also a whole lot more. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts about this turn to trust. Why aren't we just talking about how to ensure a just AI? And what does trust add to this conversation? Like, it doesn't seem to add a reason that gets us something new that we can't get through these other ideas like justice. Is it an additional reason? Is it crowding out a different kind of discussion? So, and it gets paired a lot, right? Trust and safety. And so that's sort of the discussion is kind of going in a particular direction. And what I'm not hearing is justice. And I find that super interesting. And actually a little troubling, even though why don't we care about trust? Of course, everybody wants trustworthy AI. But I'm kind of just interested in how that's shifted, it seems to me. And yet I'm not seeing that trust gets at something unique in terms of regulatory responses. So then I get worried that this other language is getting displaced by this language of trustworthiness. I was just kind of curious as to your thoughts on that.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for a really profoundly important question. If I'll come at it from a different angle on the relationship between trust and law, and there is a recurring question around the relationship between trust and contract. That trust exists in the space that isn't covered by contract. Okay, so that notion of trust as an invisible institution, and the institutional economists talk about this quite a bit around the extent to which there are implicit contracts that aren't legally framed, but which continue to shape interactions and reduce transaction costs. So that question of whether trust sits at the frontiers of what is not covered by formal institutions such as contract and constitutions and law generally is there. In terms of the question of justice, I would certainly see questions of justice as central to the development of AI. I think the point there around are they different ways of addressing the challenges of AI, if I understand that correctly, is an open one. I think it might partly be framed by the concept of the social that is underpinning it. And I should say also, in what I've discussed, there is implicitly a question of how we understand the nature of the state and state institutions. So do we understand corporate power and state power as largely fused, in which case the struggle for justice has to come from outside of those institutional forms? Or do we see the state as potentially a form of countervailing power to corporate forms, in which case the struggle for justice can be derived in and through state institutions, and indeed in and through the law, if we take that the concept of the state as an extended one. So I think that the language of trust, and I'm really interested to get more into this question, the language of trust coexists in the computer science space and in the social science space, but is used somewhat differently. So I've been thinking about what are the bridges between sort of social trust of the sort that we've been discussing and trusted systems and so forth that come out of computer science. So I think that's a question that is an ongoing challenge. But I think the relationship of law to trust is, I think, one that is more readily answerable in the sense of the formal and the informal. The question of justice and trust is one that I think is an ongoing conversation.
Okay, thanks, Terry. I've got a question from Steve, and Steve, you look like you can ask that question yourself. So
yeah, it is a little bit complex. So I really enjoyed the talk. A lot of it's at that sort of higher level. I'm going to try to bring it down to a real concrete sort of problem that I'm in the middle of a little bit, which is I've been working with a number of teachers in some school boards and working with administrators as well. And of course, they have this tricky situation where they know they need to be teaching AI in classrooms because students need, it's part of their world. And yet, after the pandemic and all that's gone through, and the fact that a lot of teachers don't really even understand AI all that well, it's really hard to get a bunch of these teachers on board. There's a group that are eager and excited and jumping, and then there's another group that are like, I don't want anything to do with this. And so in trying to understand how to help that other group, I haven't haven't talked in terms of trust. I talked in terms of fear and how to move them from fear to excitement, and the role that playing with the tech has. We describe these what we call wonder. So I say wonder is the path between fear and opportunity, and I want them to see the opportunity in AI rather than the fear. And so I've talked a lot about these wonder sessions to show them what's possible and to let them see that they can do things in the classroom with AI that we couldn't do without it. And once they see that opportunity, now that fear starts to dissipate a little bit. I wonder what your thoughts were on that whole notion of the, the fear to opportunity via wonder, and if you see it as mapping onto the same trust sort of dynamic you've been talking about.
Okay, two things. One is yes, they will have to grapple with AI because their students are using it. Some may have seen that survey of Harvard undergraduates that finds about 95% are now using ChatGPT. There are similar questions between schools and universities, although I'm aware that in the school sector they're doing this with a lot fewer resources and high demands. The fear's not new. There was a fear of Wikipedia. There was a fear of YouTube. There's in Australia a very live fear of young people and mobile phones at present. These exist. In the university sector and in my own institution, what I would observe is that AI moved from something that a particular group of people had interest in to something that everyone had an interest in about 2 years ago, when it became apparent that you could use ChatGPT to write a long form essay. Whether it's a good long form essay, we'll see. But what it brought to the forefront was the extent to which mass higher education had come to rely upon particular, forms of assessment that can where the response can be semi-automated.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately that's what sort of bred that's what associated AI with cheating. Is the introduction was AI as a cheating tool, and that's where we're trying to let teachers say, hey, it's way more than that. There's opportunities in this too, but breaking that initial first impression is really difficult.
Well, the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek offered the interesting perspective on this, which said that sure, let's let the students write their essays using AI, and we'll grade the essays using AI, and then we can all go out in the park and talk philosophy. That's one perspective on it. I think it's actually brought us back to questions of assessment.
Yeah,
where I am, and the extent to which maybe the problem lies less in the student cheating than in the business model. If you like, and unraveling that business model will be hard. But that sort of mass assessment model of the long form essay is very prone to being displaced.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate. If there's other questions, please cut me off, Beth. But you went into my world, which is assessment. so I have to just ask you one little question to get your thoughts. One of the things we're working on in our lab is creating what we call HAL, back to HAL, but a different HAL, a holistic assessment of learning. The idea of a chat bot that could do an oral assessment of you. So you sit, you talk to the chat, it asks you all these questions about everything you learned, etc., and then it ends up with a holistic assessment of what you've gotten out of the class, totally, changing the whole way we do assessments and the long essays and the short essays. And that's the kind of thing where we try to tell teachers, hey, if we did standardized testing this way, maybe it would be good, right? If it was doing a really good quality assessment. That's kind of how I see things going. But again, that question of getting them to trust in a brand new approach to everything, because AI does seem to be telling everybody kind of clear the table, look at things fresh, and let's think about how to go forward.
It's also going to be offered as part of proprietary systems by profit-making businesses. So there's understandable skepticism there as well.
True.
I've got a final question, pulling it from the chat from Kay, and I think it builds on some of the points that Steve was making. The question is, Terry, is it possible to re-educate AI in regard to bigotry and bias at play within the programming? And I think I would add to that question, is there a way to tune society into what the automation systems are doing? So not just on the programming of AI, but also the societal reception.
I feel that that's a question where I really need the insights of the computer scientists. We've been relying on these models, these large language models that have been arbitrarily sucking up data from multiple sources. I mean, ChatGPT was drawing it from Reddit, we probably going to get there, so is there the possibility of small language models, if I was to put it that way, that can do something different? To what extent can the data on which we train AI models be more bespoke? Is it simply a matter that the more data, the more accurate the model? I don't personally know, but I do know, I do recognise that the biases in society are likely to come back to us in forms of the biases derived from machine learning, derived from biased data, if that's the pathway that we go upon. I see Steve has a point there in the chat.
I think we might have to wrap things up, but we can connect you and Steve. Looks like you guys might have more to talk about. So Terry, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really rich, and you can tell from the level of the conversation. We also are thanking everyone for joining us today. We're going to wrap up our first seminar, but join us next week, Wednesday, September 25th. We will welcome Adam Taman Kalai, the technical staff member and research scientist at OpenAI, and that talk will be When Calibration Goes Awry, Hallucination in Language Models. So that's obviously fascinating.
Thank you very much for having me today.